Greetings and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I am Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is the Center Square's Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief, Casey Harper. How are things, Casey?
Things are good, Dan. How about you?
Things are good, except for the inches and inches of snow that I'm looking at falling outside my...
Are you snowed in?
I will be probably in a matter of hours. We're supposed to get more than 12 inches of snow today, which today is Friday, December 12th, our recording time, Casey. We learned this week that if inflation again reared its ugly head in December, with consumer prices rising at an unhealthy rate. At the same time, the Center Square Voters' Voice poll shows that inflation is Americans' top concern as we get into 2024, which also, of course, is a presidential election year. Let's start with the December data. Casey, what can you tell our listeners?
Yeah, I can tell you that the consumer prices rose more than expected for the month of December. This really bucked a trend for consumer prices of almost no increase or very, very little increase. And of course, that increase was very much welcomed by economists and Americans as well, who were used to seeing prices steadily rise and often spike in the first couple of years of the Biden administration in particular. In fact, since Biden took office, prices have risen about 17%. So that's why inflation data, which is something, Dan, we've both been doing journalism for years, and monthly inflation data never had the level of media attention in the past that it does now. But there's good reason for that. It's that 17% number. So the CPI, as it's called, the Consumer Price Index, rose 0.3% in December alone. That's 3.4% in the last 12 months. Now, if you look across, that's consumer goods and services. Different goods and different services rose or fell. It's not monolithic, but some interesting things that we did see was food prices, for instance, rose. The energy index rose 0.4%. We saw that the cost of shelter rose. So food prices rose 0.2%. Shelter prices rose 0.5%. And so these aren't, it's not like you can avoid this rise in consumer prices if you just don't go to Macy's and you kind of tighten the budget. These are basic things. This is food, this is shelter, and this is your energy bill. And so it's affecting all Americans. And I think we've seen in polling and we've just seen anecdotally that Americans are feeling the pinch on their budgets.
Well, let's talk about the polling, Casey, when it comes to inflation. In the Center Square Voters' Voice poll that we conducted just a few days ago, we asked the more than 2,500 likely voters throughout the country, what is their essentially biggest concern facing them heading into 2024? And the number one response from voters was inflation getting worse, which in December we saw. We don't know what the trend's going to like heading into January and the rest of the year, but we did see elevated inflation again in December, 38%. And we offered voters who were polled a bunch of different potential responses, but 38% of likely voters said inflation, and that was far and away the top concern of voters who were surveyed.
Yeah, and I don't want to be alarmist. I think that this data does just put a big question mark on inflation and on the economy. It's not necessarily a guaranteed exclamation point for 2024. We're not trying to be apocalyptic here. For instance, the Producer Price Index data just came out and did see a decrease. So it's possible that maybe last month, December, that is, was a blip, an anomaly on the radar that, is going to be corrected and we're not going to see as a trend in 2024. But given what we've seen over the last couple of years, it's a good question to ask and say, is this happening again? Is it rising? And of course, we'll monitor that closely at thecentersquare.com and on this program. But I think, another consideration, Dan, is the 2024 presidential election. Of course, our Center Square Voters' Voice poll, asked about presidential candidates. And if there's any candidate who's watching these numbers closely, it's President Joe Biden, who has, as I said, saw that 17% price increase since he took office. And then, curiously tried to label this Bidenomics push, where he tried to take credit for the economy. And there are some good things about the economy. Unemployment has been relatively low. We have bounced back to a pretty good degree from the COVID era shutdowns, which really hurt the economy. So there have been some good economic markers, but he has labeled and branded this economy as his own. So if over 2024, this inflation continues to rise at the level that we saw in December with consumer prices, he's going to have a real problem on his hands in the polls and with everyday Americans.
And the latest, the Center Square Voters Voice poll indicates that Biden could actually be in trouble. You wrote about it this week at the CenterSquare.com. Trump has surpassed Biden in national polling in a hypothetical match. It doesn't sound like it's going to be a hypothetical matchup at this point, let's face it. But in a matchup between Biden and Trump in November, the 2,500 plus registered voters, likely voters that we talked to, preferred Trump to Biden by 4 percentage points, which is outside of the 2% margin of error of the polling. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and this is not just, hey, same old story, Trump is winning again. We have seen Trump really increase his numbers nationally steadily. And so there is a trend here in favor of Trump. There's no bones about it. This is a good poll for Trump and a bad poll for Biden. Even more, another interesting thing to look at is that Trump is outperforming Biden in several swing states. In fact, essentially all of the swing states, Trump is outperforming Biden. Of course, the way American presidential politics is set up, it can really come down to 2 or 3 swing states. The national polling is very interesting. It affects fundraising. It affects the general sentiment towards candidates. But when it comes down to electoral votes, it might just be a couple of states. And at that state level, Trump is outperforming well. It's not like Trump is just winning nationally, but when you look into the numbers and dig into the states, he actually doesn't have a chance. It's not that way at all. Trump is looking good across every metric. And so I think the Biden campaign, if you're a Democrat listening, and I hope you are, I think there's going to be some unease. There's going to be some questions about why this very old candidate who's losing to Trump is being given a free pass. I think that's a question a lot of Democrats are asking right now. And we actually wrote about that question, Dan, at thecentersquare.com because we had one poll question about Michelle Obama. I don't know if you want to update our voters on this because I thought it was our listeners because I thought it was a very interesting question.
Yeah, just briefly to summarize, we asked if Democratic voters could wave a magic wand and decide who the president should be. Michelle Obama surpassed President Biden in their responses. But just to close the loop on this, Casey, getting back to inflation, it being a presidential year with Trump already leading Biden both in the polls, both nationally and in the key swing states, if inflation continues to be elevated throughout 2024, we know a lot of people vote based on their pocketbook. And with the cost of everything significantly higher than before Biden took office, that could be a key factor on voters' minds when they do go to the polls. But Casey, we need to wrap this up. Casey will be covering, the first voters will be weighing in Monday in the Iowa caucuses. We talked about in a separate episode this week of America's Talking. So if you're enjoying this episode, go look for our other episodes this week at americastalking.com. As I mentioned, Casey will be covering the Iowa caucuses Monday night. Check out his coverage at thecentersquare.com. We are out of time. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.